Hi, this is Bob Nichols. I'm here with Kevin Collins. We're with Bracewell. We're talking to you this morning about a topic that Kevin and I have dealt with frequently over the course of the last 20 plus years, which is process safety management. We come at this from different directions. Kevin is a former assistant U.S. attorney. He has very substantial experience with both environmental compliance and occupational safety and health compliance, as well as addressing catastrophic events and dealing with multi-agency investigations of those events. I have a more traditional OSHA background extending back some 30 years, and I was around to watch PSM be codified at 1910-119 in 1992, and saw the enforcement efforts that began in earnest in 2007 with the petroleum refining industry and then the chemical industry, and the particular emphasis on PSM enforcement during the Dr. Michaels era at OSHA, and had the opportunity to sit through a variety of PSM inspections, both programmed and non-programmed inspections in the chemical industry, the petroleum industry, and the food and beverage industry. And for those of you who may not realize it, because of the use of ammonia in refrigeration for the food and beverage industry across the United States, PSM is a very significant concern. One of the things I want to do today, we want to do today, and Kevin is uniquely capable and well-positioned to address this, is offer some insights, practically speaking, about the interaction between 1910-119, promulgated by the United States Department of Labor, and EPA's RMP standard. Let me turn it over to Kevin to offer you some thoughts based on his experiences with those two standards.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks for allowing me to join you today and make this presentation to our group. I think the first thing that probably everyone on the phone realizes is there's a significant amount of overlap between the two programs. The two programs are designed to reduce the risk of chemical accidents and other types of safety-related accidents in the regulated community. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap, but there are some differences. You know, philosophically, the process safety management standard is obviously a standard that's designed to protect workers. It's under the OSHA Act, whereas the risk management program plan is really designed to protect the environment and the community. Sometimes when I talk with people that don't have experience with the plan, I sort of talk about a swimming pool and then the area around the swimming pool. The pool's the plant, and that's where the workers are, and that's where OSHA really is focused. The picnic tables and everything around the swimming pool is the community and the broader environment, and that's where EPA tends to focus. So as a result, to the extent there are differences between the plans, those differences really lie in some of the specific requirements that the risk management program imposes on the regulated community. And most importantly, under the RMP, covered facilities have to develop and provide a risk management plan, and they have to use hazard analysis to estimate the offsite impacts due to both worst case and alternate case release scenarios. That doesn't exist in the PSM program. And so there's a whole element that you need to audit against and to plan for to ensure that you're taking those steps correctly. You also have to submit your 5-year accident history and update that accident history after significant accidents under the RMP program. Another significant difference, and really the last one I'm going to talk about before we move on with the rest of the PSM standard, is there are differences with respect to the applicability threshold criteria under the two plans. For example, you take a compound like hydrogen sulfide under the PSM standard, the threshold is 1,500 pounds, whereas under the RMP threshold, it's 10,000 pounds. Ammonia has different threshold amounts. It also has different concentration percentages in its solutions. And then there are a few differences in the two lists. Both lists have chemicals that really trigger your duties and responsibilities under the relevant standards. And there are some minor differences, not minor, but there are some differences between those two lists.
Yeah, and in more and more we find ourselves dealing with RMP and PSM simultaneously, for example, at chemical facilities. And it can represent some challenges, especially when both agencies are involved. And what will happen, what will trigger these multiple agency involvements is often not programmed inspections, but employee complaints. And what employees will do, what a disgruntled employee will do, some of you have experienced these individuals, they will call every agency they can think of. And in the chemical industry or the petroleum refining industry, many of them realize that PSM is an area of particular sensitivity. They've been through the applicable training. They've been lectured about the PHAs, et cetera. And they know that that's a vulnerability point for their industry. So they'll call the EPA, they'll call OSHA, and perhaps other agencies. And next thing you know, you're dealing simultaneously with an RMP investigation and an OSHA inspection. And that can represent really significant challenges. And Kevin in particular has dealt with multiple investigations, including chemical board involvement. And you have to be careful to recognize the differences, as Kevin pointed out, but also remember not to take inconsistent positions with the two agencies.
No, I think that's right. I think, in addition to sort of the whistleblower trigger, the trigger I'm most used to dealing with is when there's been some sort of catastrophic accident or release like Bob was describing. And in that instance, you have a myriad of different agencies that are all descending upon your facility. They all are interested in gathering a lot of the same information. They're quite jealous of one another. If you give all your information to OSHA first, the Chemical Safety Board doesn't like that, or EPA doesn't like that. And so you really have to have a plan going forward to make sure that you're managing the interaction among all those different competing agencies and meeting what they want.
So we've talked about the basics, and most of you are in industries, petroleum, refining, chemical facilities, et cetera, that are covered, and you understand this. And next, I want to address it. I'd like Kevin to address an especially difficult issue, which is RAGAGEP, and it's hard to conceive of a more amorphous concept that we deal with in the law. And in the midst of high stakes audits, both from an EPA and an OSHA perspective, Kevin has had to tackle these issues. So I'll let him address some thoughts about RAGAGEP.
Yeah, so RAGAGEP, recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. It's a mouthful, and even the acronym we've created for it is a mouthful. But there's been some activity with RAGAGEP and its use over the last couple of years. There was a significant case that opened up the window that allowed the Obama administration to promulgate some policy guidance for OSHA that was pretty aggressive with respect to RAGAGEP. Industry pushed back. I'm sure many of you on the phone were part of that pushback. You know some of this background. And so we have this new policy statement from OSHA circa 2016. But where RAGAGEP matters is it's really the playbook that you're supposed to be following with respect to your operations, and it gets dialed in specifically to a couple of standards, and I just want to make sure that everyone on the phone knows where that gets dialed in. So under process safety information, which is 119D3, there's two places where RAGAGEP gets mentioned. It's that the employer shall document that all of its equipment applies with RAGAGEP. That's Romanet 2. And then for existing equipment that's been designed and constructed in accordance with code, standards, or practices that are no longer in general use, the employer needs to document, what it's doing with that equipment to make sure that equipment is safe. And so that's in the process safety information standard. And then in the mechanical integrity standard, it pops up in two places, and it relates to inspection and testing, and that your inspection and testing procedures need to follow RAGAGEP, and that the frequency of your inspections and testing should be consistent with RAGAGEP or with your own personal, understanding of your plants and your facilities. And so there's a lot of guidance out there that may qualify as RAGAGEP for you. And for those of you that work with pipes, there's a whole bevy of API guidance out there. API 570, which is in-service inspection, rating, repair. 571 is damage mechanisms. There's 510. There's all kinds of guidance out there. There's risk-based inspection guidance. There's ASME 3B 1.1 guidance for piping. And so from an inspection perspective, if you're an attorney and you're trying to assist the business unit, or if you're an EHS senior manager or manager and you're trying to collate all and corral all this information, you need to know what RAGAGEP applies to the processes that are covered by the standard or the risk management program, and have that at the ready. Have it, at least have a roadmap to help you find that if you're asked for it. Because one of the simple things they can give you when they're inspecting is they ask you, what do you think applies? And that's a very specific and often asked question in a first request for information is, what do you think are the relevant standards that apply to this process unit? And you need to have an answer for that.
Yeah. I want to talk about preparing for a PSM inspection. Because PSM is a performance-based standard rather than a prescriptive standard, preparing can sometimes be a question of where do you start? Well, where you start is that while PSM is generally a performance-based standard, not a prescriptive standard, the standard does have prescriptive rules. It has time periods, such as the 5-year PHA revalidation, the 3-year compliance audits, certain annual certifications under various sections of PSM. And I will tell you, and if you look at the OSHA's inspection checklist that they use for PSM inspections that's available on their website, they start with the basics. And I am amazed by how often we have really sophisticated clients who've done a great job thinking about the performance-based elements of PSM and employing engineers and consultants and establishing a really good team for like PHAs to do a great job, but they miss basics. Maybe they do the compliance audit, maybe they do the certification, but they haven't properly documented it. Well, I will tell you, like all of us, OSHA compliance officers and OSHA PSM engineers are very, very busy. And first and foremost, they look for low-hanging fruit. They're there, they've got to get out of there, they've got other things to do, and they've got their checklist. And if you've missed the 5 years, even by a short period of time, if you've missed the 3 years, if you had a significant incident and you didn't create the appropriate incident investigation report, they will cite you. That's black and white. There are prescriptive rules. But this is what's even more significant. If you come out clean on the basic elements of PSM, if your PHA has all the requisite elements, if you've gathered all the required elements of PSI, if your investigation reports touch all the required bases, so you've followed all the prescriptive rules, there's a good chance that this busy compliance officer or OSHA engineer is going to think you're a good actor. And conversely, if you miss basics, they think you're a sloppy operation very often. And then they do a deep dive into things like your diagrams to see if they're up to date. They'll really look at the reasonableness of your MOCs and your operating procedures because they think, aha, they didn't get all of the basic prescriptive rules right, so they must not have a very good program. And you find yourself now engaged in an in-depth look at your PSM program, including the performance-based issues like what is RAGAGEP in your instance and whether you've met it. So I can't emphasize enough that you should be regularly checking. Your organization should be regularly checking. Do we have all of the basics of 1910-119 accomplished? And what I've seen is PSM has gotten older. We've gotten more comfortable with it. And I see companies forgetting about MOCs. I see companies forgetting when there's an incident that doesn't involve deaths, that doesn't involve major property loss, that they're forgetting that they still have an incident investigation covered event that they need to do. Because remember, it's not only an event that results in substantial damage or personal injury, it's events that could have resulted in a major release. Yep. And OSHA will ding you if you have those kinds of near misses and you haven't done the requisite incident investigation. So you got to get the basics right. What are your thoughts about that, Kevin?
Well, I want to dial into one specific standard and provide some detail as to what a what a non-engineer might be able to do to help the organization move forward in light of a PSM inspection. So let's talk about process hazard analyses, or PHAs. And with respect to PHAs, there's some questions that just need to be answered, generally speaking. Number one, does the PHA effectively address the hazards of the process? And picking up on something Bob just mentioned, does the PHA include prior incidents, especially recent prior incidents that occurred in that process area and had the potential for catastrophic release? And that's something that a better PSM inspector will be looking for when they're in your facility and they're going through your paperwork. Does your PHA address facility siting? And if you have a facility that's in a flood-prone area, like say the greater Houston area, that's had 3 500-year floods in the last 3 years, you need to look at facility siting and expand that process to include not only where you're putting your buildings with respect to the blast zone, but also where are you putting your buildings and emergency generators with respect to the revised floodplain maps that have been coming out. Does your PHA address human factors? Does your PHA recommend appropriate engineering and administrative controls? And does your PHA consider the range of safety and health effects due to the failure of those controls? And the way a PSM PSM inspector will come in and look at that, I really see, a range of inspectors. I know Bob sees this in all the years that he's done this. You've got your sort of garden variety PSM inspector that Bob was describing earlier. You've got your rookie inspector that really doesn't even understand what he or she might be doing. Then you might have the professor type who comes in and really feels like they've got a philosophy developed over time and they're going to do this in a certain way. And with respect to that third, that professor type inspector, what I've seen them do with respect to PHAs is take a PHA, ask these background questions I just went through, identify the safeguards that your PHA team is allowing you to take credit for, and then go look at each individual safeguard or a sampling of those safeguards and check the preventative maintenance program on those safeguards to make sure that, the safeguard's not only in place, but is also being maintained in a way that suggests that it will perform if you have an incident in which that safety instrumented system, for example, is designed to prevent the catastrophe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the facility citing is so important because it's just it's a common citation item in PSM inspections. And it amazes me that sometimes things as basic, again, we talked about a blast, that there's not an appropriate blast study for a control room. And often the employer has actually engaged in the requisite siting analysis, but they haven't properly documented it. You've got to make sure you've got appropriate facility siting documentation. Let me make some other points about getting ready for inspections. First of all, a reoccurring basic, again, black and white problem we have is that in connection with PSM compliance, our clients establish deadlines. After all, there are various components of PSM where you establish deadlines. PHAs, incident investigations, you have to come up with a plan for how you're going to remedy concerns, and you need to establish a schedule for when you're going to remedy those concerns. Well, again and again, sometimes because of changes in personnel, very often because people are just so darn busy, those self-imposed deadlines are not met. We'll talk about low-hanging fruit. If they come in and you've promised that a PHA reevaluation, and they view it as a promise, that you intend to do X, Y, or Z by such and such date, or you had a near miss and you've got an incident investigation and you've indicated the following corrective actions will be taken by the following dates. If you've missed those dates, you've just bought yourself a citation. So one question that comes up with clients is, well, Bob, what if there's intervening events? Sometimes it's things as mundane as capital expenditures, maybe it's operational difficulties. But what if we can't meet the deadline and we need to extend it? Well, then at very minimum, you better clearly document that you're not missing the deadline. You've extended the deadline with an explanation as to why that will appeal to an OSHA compliance officer as to why that extension is necessary. And ideally, some explanation as to why employees are safe in the interim under current conditions. But don't miss deadlines and not document. If you need an extension, grant yourself an extension, but document it properly, and ideally don't miss those deadlines. But if you have blown deadlines in your PSM documentation, you'll get a citation potentially for every missed deadline. And I just see clients do a great job, and often it's because the personnel involved change, but these deadlines get missed, and that again is low-hanging fruit. A couple other points I want to make. Let me tell you another trick that OSHA compliance officers use in PSM inspections to see if you've got only a really good paper program or whether you have, in fact, a real-life operating effective PSM program. What they'll do is they'll interview operations employees, and they'll ask them basic questions about your PSM program. They'll ask them if they know how to access the PHA. They'll ask them about mechanical integrity or MOCs. And they'll ask about employee participation in the various elements of PSM, which is required. If your PSM program is exclusively managed and shaped by management level employees, you're violating PSM. You're required to have employee participation. There should be employee participation in every phase of PSM. And so what they'll do, and as many of you know, having been through a compliance audit, you're not entitled to be in the room with non-supervisory employees. So they pull a non-supervisory employee in for a private interview, and they flunk PSM 101, okay? Well, you're going to get, there's a very good chance you're going to get citations. So you've got to have this really good written program we talked about where you meet all the deadlines and you've checked all the boxes as you go through 1910-119, but you've got to educate and continually re-educate your employees about the basics of PSM. Because if they don't understand it, the conclusion is going to be, you've got a lousy PSM program. One other thing I want to say is don't forget about subsection H of 1910-119 contractors. We live in a world where contingent workers are a bigger and bigger part of how companies operate. But you need to remember, as an operator, you're going to be responsible for those contract employees or those independent contractors. And if they're taking actions not consistent with PSM or not consistent with your operating procedures, you're going to get dinged for it. And even if none of your employees were involved in the transgression, under OSHA, they have every right to cite you. Because their view is going to be you controlled the hazard, and you as the operator are ultimately responsible under 1910-119. So don't forget about auditing and keeping a close watch on your contractors with regard to PSM compliance. Let me turn it back to Kevin to share any further thoughts he has about managing and preparing for inspections.
Yeah, I think two things. You know, Bob noted that under the statute in the OSHA Act, hourly employees are supposed to be able to have private meetings with the inspectors, and that's certainly in the statute, and I agree, obviously. But I've had some success in the last year or two about, you know, developing a good working relationship with the hourly employees, not being adversarial with them, trying to, you know, say that although I'm a lawyer for the company, we're really trying to get to a safe environment, and if there are issues, let's figure out what those issues are. And the net result of building that rapport with the hourly workforce has been, in many instances, I've been able to sit in on those hourly interviews. Now, OSHA hates it. The area office hates it. But when they pump it up to Madeline Lee or the other regional solicitors' offices, they can't do anything about it. If the employee says on the record and with that inspector, oh, no, I like Bob. I know he doesn't represent me personally, but I have no problem with Mr. Nichols being in the interview. He's in the interview.
And I've had the same experience Kevin has had. And what I've seen is in the pre-Dr. Michaels era, the pre-Obama administration era, we used to be able to pull that off with some frequency. Dr. Michaels came along for 8 years. There's no doubt he cares a great deal about safety, and he took a hard line. You'll remember the Secretary of Labor talking about a new sheriff in town. And they were really, really difficult about making sure that no lawyer found their way into a non-supervisor's interview. By the way, remember this, your EHS people, they act for management. So your position with OSHA when they interview any ESH compliance personnel or specialist is that they're management, and I get to be in there. Because let me tell you right now, OSHA will take the position, they bind you with regard to occupational safety and health compliance. But I absolutely agree that there's no doubt we're seeing a loosening again under the current administration. I want to turn to another topic where Kevin has lots of unique experience. Both of us have been involved in catastrophic events, but Kevin has been involved in some of the largest. And I'd like Kevin to share with you the importance and significance of PSM in the construct of a catastrophe.
Yeah, PSM and RMP, there's a lot of overlap, and so it's really process safety that's at the heart of this. And that's the playbook that these agencies are looking at. And they're trying to decide in the wake of a significant catastrophic incident, whether or not the company met its obligations under those two regulatory programs, whether or not its practices are consistent with the RAGAGEP that industry seems to be doing. And, from a lawyer's perspective, we're really talking about what is the standard of care here, and has the company met its standard of care with respect to these regulatory frameworks and RAGAGEP. And so when you have, like Bob and I mentioned earlier, you've had a significant catastrophic incident or release, you've got a myriad of agencies who are in place. They're all driven by different goals, different timelines. I mean, Bob and I have been in situations where a congressperson has called OSHA, at the secretary level, and all of a sudden there's a PSM audit team that shows up, whereas before they might not have been interested. And so I think the key is don't be afraid to assert control. Remember, this is your private property. We've had an incident and maybe people have been injured or killed, which is a terrible situation, but this is your private property, and you should not be afraid to assert some modicum of control over the process. It just needs to be transparent. And I think the more you interact with all these different inspection teams, the easier it is to exert some control, because hopefully you've created some trust with them over time. One thing I like to do, and maybe I don't do this with all the agencies at once, but I do it individually with each agency, is to have a quick tabletop discussion with the inspection team and get them oriented to the facility, get them oriented to the process, make sure they have a good org chart, and in an hour and a half with the inspection team and a couple of engineers, oftentimes quote off the record, just to get them oriented, it can speed them up quite a bit. And from my perspective, my definition of success is getting that team out of the facility as quickly as possible so that the business unit can get back to production.
I want to talk just briefly about self-auditing and PSM. The interesting part about PSM that makes it unique from lots of OSHA standards is it has a compliance audit component to it, mandatory compliance audits every 3 years. And frankly, also the incident investigation subsection 1910.0 is really sort of a audit provision too, because when you have a covered incident, you have to self-assess and come up with corrective actions. One thing, of course, that I hope all of you understand is that when you're engaging in conduct associated with complying with those sections, 1910.0, 1910M, it is inconceivable that those events will be regarded as privileged undertakings. Even if the lawyers are deeply involved, you're complying with what you're required to do under 1910.119, and the fruits of that audit, of course, or that incident investigation are not going to be privileged. You have to be, in the case of an incident investigation, you have to be ready to show OSHA a report if they ask someday of your incident investigation, and it better not have what you regard as privileged information in it. Now, what you can do is, you certainly can do a parallel privileged investigation. In fact, most organizations, when they do the incident investigation, assuming counsel's involved, there'll be components to their examination of what occurred that are privileged. But you should not mix up your incident investigation under 1910M with a privileged investigation. And by the way, let me just talk a little bit about the OSHA self-auditing policy. In 2000, like with EPA, OSHA issued a policy generally saying they wouldn't seek self-audit results. Well, what I've learned, and I especially learned it during the Dr. Michaels incident era, is that obviously that policy does not have the force of law, and therefore, they can disregard their audit policy as they see fit. So the best protection you have if you want to conduct an audit separate and apart from 19.0 or 19M compliance, if you want to conduct an attorney-client privilege investigation, your best bet is use of the attorney-client privilege.
Yeah, just to jump in here at the end, I mean, that is an area that consistently courts have said, if there's a regulatory reason why you're doing whatever it is you're doing, incident investigation report, compliance audit, then that is not going to be a privileged event, and that is a loser. It doesn't matter if lawyers are involved or not. And so the thing to do, like Bob described, is, you need to set up a parallel program. The case law on this has a nickname. It's called the Cavell Doctrine, and it's a 1961 case that involved taxes. But the point of Cavell is, as an attorney, I need assistance, engineering assistance in most cases with PSM, to better understand the engineering and what's happening, the safety systems, so that I'm, as a lawyer, capable of rendering legal advice to my client. And so you need to stand these teams up under the Cavell Doctrine. Bob and I certainly can help you do that. A quick phone call will enlighten you with respect to that if you don't know how to do that. Bob, any final thoughts?
Yeah, the fact that you can conduct a privileged investigation separate and apart from your compliance audits that is protected by the attorney-client privilege is clear from the Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission's 2011 decision in Delic Refining, where they're clearly indicated that you can have lawyers look at your PSM program along with consultants like they did in Delic Refining and have it privileged. Just don't mix up those privileged inspections with your compliance audits or incident investigations to comply with 1910-119. That's all I have, Kevin. I know we certainly appreciate everyone's time, and we hope the program today was helpful.
Yep. Thank you very much, everyone.